window.
Okay.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Afro-Asian Solidarity Hour. This is a Be Bold and Mosaic collaboration event. So Be Bold recognizes Afro-Asian solidarity is vital, and we acknowledge the shared violence and harm that has been recently experienced by African and Asian American people, which is most recently highlighted by the pandemic. All right, and I'm going to start with the Thrive moment. 3 tips for managing a diverse team. So when you're managing a diverse team, there are 3 things that you want to focus on. Being connection. So find out what motivates your employees and what they're passionate about. 2, create. 2 is creative collaboration. So communicate what is expected of your employees and let them collaborate on how to best achieve them. And then the last one would be constant communication. So giving frequent coaching and feedback on how team members are doing and where they could have greater impact. Okay, and then Mo, you said introduction, or do you want me to pass it to she?
So if you can go to the next slide, we'll go over ground rules, and
Yep.
then then we can do introductions.
Yep. All right. And the ground rules for today's session, we're going to ask that everybody be respectful and actively listen, be patient, engaged, try to understand what is being discussed, assume positive intent, and respect the sensitivity and confidentiality of the conversation. And then she.
Hello everyone, this is Chi from Mosaic or Asian ERG. Next, I will introduce our guest speaker, Raven, today. Raven is a Black Jewish digital educator and researcher at Northwestern University, pursuing her degree in Black Studies. Her research explores Afro-Asian solidarities and coalition building, as well as Black and Jewish relationality. Before her studies at Northwestern, Raven studied at Cornell University, majoring in feminist, gender, sexuality studies, and Asian studies, with a concentration in China and double minors in equity studies and Africana studies. In addition to her academic endeavors, Raven also works as a content creator and keynote speaker, bringing the expertise of academia to life in digital spaces allows Raven to serve the communities she loves and cherishes. Her work online unpacks the possibilities of the digital humanities and the exciting ways it allows us to learn. As Gen Z increasingly turns to digital methods of learning, educators need to adapt. And as a member of Gen Z themselves, Raven is up for the challenge. Next, I will hand it over to Raven.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, okay. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation with you all. Can we see everything okay? Yes? Amazing. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Raven Schwam-Curtis. I use they and she pronouns, and I am beyond excited to be here with you today to discuss something of paramount importance, Black History Month and Afro-Asian and Black Pacific Islander solidarities. I do want to preface this talk by saying that I am Black and Jewish, and while I don't identify as Asian American or indigenous to the Pacific Ocean or Oceania, to use more indigenous-centric term, I care deeply about connectivity between these communities. As someone who is multiracial, I live in this in-between space between the Black and Jewish communities, and I've always had to navigate and negotiate multiple identities. I think that this lived experience has given me some of the tools to think about what is necessary to foster care between two communities, especially when there are old or lingering animosities. I share my personal background not to be self-aggrandizing, but rather to give you a sense of how I'm personally arriving to the conversation today. So my goals at the end of this talk, I want you to walk away with 3 main things. 1, a better understanding of Afro-Asian and Black Pacific Islander solidarities and discontents. 2, a firmer grounding in the ways that white supremacy pits us against one another. And 3, a clearer path towards creating meaningful solidarities and coalitions because you're rooted in the truth that freedom is a collective process and we can't get free without one another. So here's a little overview of the agenda. We'll be talking about the origins of Black History Month, some recent incidents of anti-Asian and anti-Black hate and how they're related, the importance of Afro-Asian as well as Pacific Islander solidarities, foils and stereotypes. So we'll be exploring like what are the ways that the stereotypes constructed around our communities are intentionally used to pit us against one another. So more specific examples of that. We'll also be discussing some obfuscated histories, primarily the Bandung Conference, as well as solidarities with the movement for Black Lives in Indonesia with West Papua and Melanesian folks. We'll be talking about challenges to solidarity. So what are some of the things that make it difficult for us to be in community or to be in solidarity and coalition with one another? We'll also be discussing this important way that we need to disrupt the discrete notion of identity that we're completely separate or distinct peoples. How do we disrupt that, challenge that, interrogate that? And then I'll kind of leave you with some tools for future directions and how you can use all this information in your personal life moving forward. Sound good? Cool. So what is Black History Month? What are its origins and why do we observe this thing every February every year? Before Black History Month existed, we had something called Negro History Week. Carter G. Woodson played a pivotal role in the creation of Negro History Week. He was a well-respected scholar, historian, and founder of the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History. Woodson was also a member of a well-known fraternity, the Omega Psi Phi fraternity. In 1924, the Omegas created Negro History and Literature Week. This was a prelude to Negro History Week, which was created by Carter G. Woodson in February of 1926. He picked the month of February because this is a month in which Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass were born, two central figures in the imagination of Black emancipation from enslavement. Woodson felt that the anti-Black rhetoric being taught in schools was manifesting as violence against Black people in the material world. In essence, Negro History Week was about disrupting hegemonic modes or common overarching modes of knowledge and creating truer, more holistic accounts of history in schools and beyond. Because as we know, those who control our access to knowledge control the narratives that circulate in our world. Through the efforts of African-American teachers, grassroots organizing, by the end of the 1930s, Negro History Week became a cultural norm across the United States. By the early 1930s, more than 80% of Black secondary schools celebrated Negro History Week. And the tradition continued well beyond Woodson's passing in 1950. At the behest of appeals from civil rights leaders, in February of 1976, President Gerald Ford issued a statement on the importance of Black History Month to all Americans. Every president since Ronald Reagan has issued a Black History Month proclamation. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more texture as to where Black History Month came from, why we celebrate this thing, and how it's related to the United States. Very good. So how does any of this relate to our conversation about Afro-Asian solidarity specifically? Well, I'm here to speak with you today because it's Black History Month, and this is a moment for difficult yet vitally important conversations. And discussing the unrelenting nature of anti-Asian and anti-Black hate crimes is one such conversation. Let's go back temporally to the summer of 2020. The summer of 2020 marked the beginning of the pandemic and some unsettling social trends. If, like me, during quarantine, you spent time on the internet or in front of the TV watching the news, you likely saw a plethora of infographics and reports condemning the sharp rise in anti-Asian violence and police brutality against the Black community. According to the Stop AAPI Hate National Report, from March 19th of 2020 to December 31st of 2021, a total of 10,905 hate incidents were committed against Asian American and Pacific Islander folks. 4,632 of those crimes took place in 2020, and 6,273 occurred in 2021. Many people credit this notable spike in anti-Asian hate crimes to the damaging narratives that circulated at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Narratives pushed by large international figures like Donald Trump, for example, played a key role in stirring up these hateful sentiments. Anti-China geopolitical statements, derogatory references to COVID-19 using terms that I will not reiterate here, and false notions of perpetual foreignness and accompanied xenophobia. And for those who aren't familiar, xenophobia is essentially prejudice against people who are from different countries or perceived as being from different countries. And these are just a few of the threads that fueled this spike in anti-Asian hate crimes. I think it should be noted that in terms of ethnic groups, Chinese Americans continue to report the most hate incidents. So they experienced 42.8% of all anti-Asian hate crimes, which I think is really striking. The compilation of hate crime data published by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism revealed that anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 339% in 2021 compared to 2020, with New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other cities surpassing their record numbers in 2020. 339%. Let's really let that sink in. The enormity of this spike should be alarming to all of us. There is a profound ideological sickness percolating in our communities that desperately needs to be curbed. And that's not going to happen if we ignore the problem. And how can any of us forget the rampant police brutality against Black folks during the summer of 2020? The names of community members like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and most recently and tragically Tyre Nichols, will be etched into the national and international imagination for a long time to come. While this was a formative moment that generated a national dialogue about the institution of policing, this issue, much like that of xenophobia, has obviously been going on for a long time. According to data from the Washington Post, the number of fatal police shootings has risen slightly in recent years. And 2022 was the year police killed the highest number of people on record. And this is a racialized issue because Black Americans are shot at disproportionate rates. We account for roughly 14% of the US population, but we're killed by police at more than twice the rate of white Americans. But are we really surprised? Modern iterations of policing can be traced back to slave patrols. In the early 1700s, the Carolinas saw the creation of the first official slave patrol, whose sole purpose was to impose a regime of terror, put an end to slave uprisings, and to be able to track down and return escaped enslaved people to their owners. They used severe force as a tactic to maintain control and achieve desired behavior from enslaved peoples. Slave patrols were replaced by militia-style units during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. These militia-style units were created to prevent freed, formerly enslaved people from exercising their civil rights. They steadfastly and consistently upheld Black codes, which were essentially these stringent municipal and state regulations that limited and regulated former enslaved people's access to employment, salaries, voting rights, and many other liberties. Local governments in the East and Midwest United States started creating police departments in the 1900s to enforce regional regulations, notably Jim Crow legislation. Local governments relied heavily on the police to enforce Jim Crow laws and use excessive force against African Americans who disobeyed them. And these Jim Crow laws remained in place until the 1960s were over. So it's apparent that from their inception, the purpose of policing anyways, these slave patrols, right, was to control Black bodies and to protect white property, which were in fact those Black bodies. We see this in the historical narrative, and we also see some traces of this manifest in the contemporary statistics. And while the contemporary purpose of policing is supposed to be to serve and protect, the fact of the matter is that these harmful anti-Black ideologies continue to circulate prominently in law enforcement spaces, and that has deadly consequences for Black and brown bodies. So what's my point? I say all this to underline one immutable fact. Black people and Asian people in this country have been systematically targeted because we are racialized as undesirable others. And while the particularities of our oppressions differ, the lingering nature, so the fact that these things are omnipresent, they're not going away, the lingering nature of those struggles remains. So what do I mean when I say Afro-Asian solidarity? Most people I encounter are wholly unfamiliar with the term Afro-Asia, so let's break it down a little bit. I personally understand Afro-Asia to quite literally be the study of African and Asian diasporic peoples. And by diaspora, I mean people who disperse from Asia and Africa, and how these diasporic peoples relate to one another. These studies explore moments of synergy and connectivity, as well as tensions that exist between African and Asian diasporic peoples. It is important to note, however, that Asian and African diasporas are not conceptualized here as discontinuous, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Afro-Asia explores not only moments of intersection between two groups of people, say uniting an anti-colonial struggle at the Bandung Conference in 1955, but also moments of blurriness, wherein Afro and Asia become indistinguishable, say in the identity of multiracial Asian and Black children. Though I do want to note that multiracial children are not the only folks who claim multiple heritages. Culture is not necessarily this discrete, easily defined, or evidently clear phenomenon in the ways that we've come to believe, right? So why is this a helpful way of thinking about community relationships? What is the term Afro-Asia doing? When I think about the causes of anti-Asian and anti-Black racism, one driving force that comes to mind is white supremacy. So what is white supremacy? This feels like one of those terms that's been thrown around somewhat haphazardly, and as a result, how we understand it has come to be muddied. So let's get on the same page about a definition. I'm big on definitions if you couldn't tell. White supremacy is the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society, typically to the exclusion or detriment of other racial and ethnic groups. In other words, white supremacy is an ideological framework that positions white people as a superior race and everyone not racialized as white as deviant, undesirable others. Now, I want to be crystal clear, race is a colonial construct, right? When crystal clear, race is a colonial construct, which is to say it's a residue of colonialism, not a biological truth. Humans share 99.9% of the same genetic material. It's only that 0.1% that accounts for our phenotypic or visual differences. Historian Nell Painter shows us that white people have not always existed, right? So this idea of being white, being Black, being Asian, these things have not existed always across time and space. They're inventions. And the rigid categories that befall us during the Enlightenment era, where all this language starts to emerge, are fabrications that were designed to enact a white supremacist world order. In other words, the way we understand race today emerges from a long history of eugenics, which is theories of racial improvement, as well as scientific racism, which is an ideology that appropriates the methods and legitimacy of science to argue for the superiority of white Europeans and the inferiority of non-white people. That being said, while race is not a biological truth, and this has been well documented by scholars across multiple fields, both Black and Asian folks experience the painful consequences of this organizing ideology, albeit in different ways. And in that sense, we have a common goal. In the effort to promote life and livability free, or at least more free, from mythologies of race and the hate that emerges from those mythologies, we have to unite in a common struggle against white supremacy. So what does this mean for you, both personally and as someone working in a corporate setting? Understanding Afro-Asian histories is deeply important. When we allow ourselves to internalize the notion that we are discrete, segmented, and fundamentally different peoples with little or no common interests, true connection and community are disallowed. Freedom is a collective process. Where any inequity or inequality persists, others will follow. We cannot get free without one another. I literally cannot say that enough. And we can't band together if we don't understand each other and the histories from which we emerge. So my goal today is to chip away at those misunderstandings and help foster the conditions of possibility for Afro-Asian and Black Pacific Islander solidarities, both in this professional space and in your personal life. So what are some of the ways that mythologies circulated by white supremacists, which I'll talk more about this later, but white supremacists are not the same thing as white people, right? So white supremacists, when I say that, I'm referring to folks of any creed who subscribe to a specific world order and ideology, okay? So what are some of the ways that mythologies circulated by white supremacists disallow Afro-Asian solidarity? In many ways, the stereotypes about Asian and African-American folks position us as foils to one another. And by this, I mean the way we're stereotyped pits us against one another. In literary studies, a foil is a character who contrasts with another character. So let's talk about some of the ways that this manifests. Whereas the stereotype about Black men positions them as hypermasculine, hypersexualized, and almost bestial in their unrelenting sexual appetite, the stereotype about Asian men depicts them as effeminate and emasculated. So the way that Black men and Asian men are understood under the schema of white supremacy posits them as complete opposites, which I think is really interesting. These stereotypes serve a few purposes. Under the institution of slavery, all kinds of lies about the Black race circulated to justify the continuation of Black enslavement. One of these lies was that African descendant people are naturally or biologically more strong, and thus more capable of doing hard physical labor, particularly Black men. This narrative validated the enslavement of Black people because it, allegedly anyways, was our natural disposition to serve and to do so through manual labor. And there was also a lot of religious dogma that went into justifying this line of thought. Another one of these lies was that Black men were sexually uncontrollable creatures that wanted to have sex with white women. We see depictions during the antebellum era of Black men with tails looking devilish and seemingly preying on white women. White women, who especially in this moment were seen as the epitome of white womanhood, of womanhood generally, and femininity. and thus they had to be protected by white men at all costs. So this is sort of the organizing ideology that's framing this position as it relates to Black men, this stereotype as it relates to Black men. And these fallacies and stereotypes become the foundation for the continuation of anti-Black racism. These stereotypes circulated and circulate so powerfully in the wake of slavery or post-slavery that they've led to the murder of a young boy who allegedly hit on a white woman in the Jim Crow South. And here I'm referring to Emmett Till, right? So this narrative bolsters white supremacy through the justification of the institution of slavery, which created the framework for intergenerational white wealth, as well as intergenerational Black poverty, and to posit Black men as an extreme, aggressive form of masculinity that is less desirable compared to white masculinity, which is understood here as a standard of desirability. On the flip side, the emasculation of Asian and Asian American men also bolsters white supremacy, but in a very different way. As a result of their productivity in the mining and construction industries from which they were barred, Chinese immigrant men were forced into jobs as launderers, cooks, and domestic servants in the middle of the 19th century in the United States. Because this type of labor was viewed as women's work, it helped spur the stereotype that Asian men are somehow effeminate. This also falls under the purview of Orientalism. So the late cultural critic and theorist Edward Said contended in his groundbreaking 1978 book Orientalism, which is pictured here on the right, that the idea of the Orient was constructed by a European political ideology in order to control and conquer it. Said notes that the term included distinctions between East, the Orient, and West, the Occident. Orientalism was used as a tool by European powers to portray North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia incorrectly so as to justify their domination. Because Asia is imagined via Orientalism as feminized and thus conquerable, we see this being weaponized to justify all kinds of harms and atrocities. By the early 1900s, every country in Southeast Asia, except for Thailand, was under colonial control. So we can see the ways that these stereotypes and fallacies are weaponized both under the institution of slavery and via colonialism throughout Asia and the Pacific to justify all of this harm, right? Something similar happens when we look at Asian women and Black women. There's the stereotype about Asian women is that they are docile, subservient, and thus prime examples of femininity. The stereotype about Black women, on the other hand, is that we're antithetical to femininity, mannish, able to tolerate large amounts of pain, and ultimately outside the realm of women. The strong, aggressive, loud Black women were exact foils to one another again. If Black women are not seen as women, then that means they can be sexually violated under the institution of slavery. So we're seeing the ways that this serves the institution, right? These stereotypes are doing something. They're serving a white supremacist world order and ideology. And if Black women are not seen as women, and this means that they can be sexually violated under the institution of enslavement, that means that more children can be created for the institution of slavery, because Black women's wombs are conduits for the continuation of slavery, because what comes out of them, those aren't human beings, that's more property under the schema of slavery. And this is not seen as an affront because not only were enslaved African folks not considered people, Black femme folks were not considered women worthy of the dignities therein. So I'm really just trying to emphasize the harmful ways that these stereotypes both circulate then and now, and also how they justified and to some extent continue to justify systemic institutional continuations of harm. I also want to touch on the way that Blackness travels through the archipelagos or the islands of the Pacific or Oceania. I'm offering many terms because I'm not sure what language people are arriving to the conversation with, so I want to make sure I'm being attentive to that. Interestingly, when colonists like James Cook discovered Hawaii, and I say discovered because there were already indigenous people living in Hawaii, Kanaka Maoli, that's the indigenous term for them. So he didn't discover Hawaii, there were already people living there, right? So, but interestingly, when colonists like James Cook discovered Hawaii, they used their notions of racial hierarchies to describe the indigenous populations that they encountered. And many indigenous Pacific Islanders were initially understood through a lens of Blackness, particularly Melanesian people who were named for the dark pigment of their skin. So even the language that we have today to describe many indigenous populations in Oceania, Polynesian folks, Micronesian people, Melanesian people, comes from these colonial dudes who were coming to the, for lack of a better word, colonial folks who were coming to the Pacific, bringing their own lens of racial hierarchy and racialization, and using that to describe the indigenous people they were encountering. And Blackness was a part of that description, which is fascinating. So in her book, Hawaii is My Haven, Race and Indigeneity in the Black Pacific, Natasha Sharma notes that, quote, colonists attempted to discredit the Hawaiian monarchy by crafting rumors of King Kamehameha's African ancestry. The proof was his dark complexion. Queen Liliuokalani faced the same Negroification when a news writer claims that she had no real hereditary royalty, and that she and King Kalakaua were instead the illegitimate children of a mulatto shoemaker. According to Nono Silva, American cartoonists borrowed stock images of Africans and African Americans to racialize and denigrate Kanaka Maoli, which again is the indigenous term for folks indigenous to the Hawaiian Islands, depicting the queen as a pickaninny in the 1890s. So this is really fascinating, right? This racialization of Hawaiian monarchy is being enacted, is being done specifically to invalidate their claim to their monarch status. Really interesting. So all that being said, not all folks indigenous to Oceania are racialized in the same way. According to Sharma, quote, Polynesians were conceived of by Europeans as almost white and thus granted higher status than Micronesians or Melanesians, the latter considered oceanic Negroes or ignoble savages who lacked the former's societal development, physical beauty, and potential. Yet in the 19th century, Hawaiians too were called the N-word. So this is really interesting to me as well, that this racial hierarchy that's being placed on folks indigenous to Oceania, it's created discontents that continue to unfold today. Polynesian people as being considered in closer proximity to whiteness, and Micronesian. Uh-oh.
Hey, Raven, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, we just have a couple of questions in the chat. I know we're kind of covering a lot of content really quickly, but maybe you can answer a couple of questions. Donnie, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, appreciate that, Mo, and Raven. Really appreciate this historical context here. You know, one of the things that I think is so interesting is that, you know, in many instances, our progress as a country has happened when we band together and we find intersectionality in what we're doing, in our progress in general. You know, benefits us all. So I'm just wondering if you've run across any instances where there's been direct intersectionality of accomplishments of Black Americans, Asian Americans, in how that has helped you know, move our country forward. We've got all these historical Black figures that have been behind the scenes and have really contributed so much to the, you know, the history of our country. I'm just curious if you've personally come across in your research the intersectionality between Black and Asian Americans and how that's helped you know, move us forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so during the Black Power movement in like the latter half of the 20th century, there was a lot of collaboration happening between the Black community and the Asian American community. So like later on in the talk, I have some images and stuff about where we see images of people saying like free Huey Newton, and then there's also someone saying next to him that and carrying a sign that says like yellow peril supports Black power. So we see a lot of collaboration and solidarity between like Black folks and Asian American people during the Black Power movement. And also, you know, the fact that Asian American as a terminology exists is a direct result of like that being that's a political term, that's a political identity that's also born out of that moment. So there's definitely been a lot of historical solidarity and kinship that has emerged.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Do we want to do more questions or?
Yeah. Hi, Bev. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Hi. I wanted to get off my mic, turn on my mic because I usually don't do that when I start talking. But yes. Thank you, Raven, for being here today. I'd like to ask you about intersectionality between Asians and Blacks. Is that what your PhD studies are about? And yeah. And if so, yes. Is there positive findings in your research that we could share with the group as well around the intersectionality of these two different races? And if you can share that with us.
Positive findings. So insofar Like just like another moment where we've been able to work together and it's been really successful.
Yes.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, so I guess this is a little bit like later in the talk, but I was going to bring up a historical example of like the Bandung Conference, which was in 1955. This really like interesting, awesome kind of historical moment where we see African and Asian nations come together for the first time, and they're imagining, you know, their freedoms together, like well, in theory, post-colonialism, like they're now free from these Western powers that were beforehand, like in these nations, like having a very strong ruling hand, trying to imagine like what freedom and peace looks like through a very different lens and in a very different way, like the darker nations of the world, to borrow from W.E.B. Du Bois, like coming together and imagining their freedom. So I'd say that's one like shining moment in Afro-Asian history that is spoken about a lot. Like the Bandung Conference is this transnational, international moment where African and Asian nations and peoples are imagining their freedom together.
So I'm not familiar with that. Can you share a little bit about that event? You said Bandung, yeah.
Yeah, I actually, is it okay if I share the slide again? I
Yeah,
have like
sure.
a whole.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Here it is.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Bandung Conference was a couple-day conference that took place in 1955. And let's see, I'm trying to find my notes on it. I have a whole bunch of them. Bear with me. And basically, like I said, it was the first time that Asian and African nations kind of breaking away from these colonial powers, coming together to imagine a path forward together, like literally setting up their nations for the first time, not under these colonial powers for the first time in a long time. And the point of the conference was kind of multifold. It was to explore cultural problems that African and Asian nations face. And it was also about evaluating how Asian and African people could promote like world peace and cooperation together. And this was also just a decade after the conclusion of World War II. So that was fresh on everyone's mind, like this threat of nuclear war. And so a big part of this conference also was imagining more harmonious and free ways of living, like free of this nuclear terror. And yeah, I would say this quote that I have up here is from Indonesia's then President Sukarno, and I think it really encapsulates very well what the whole conference was about. And he says, our task is first to seek an understanding of each other, and out of that understanding will come a greater appreciation of each other, and out of that appreciation will come collective action. So this idea of one, trying to understand each other, from that trying to more deeply appreciate each other, and from there moving towards collective action.
Okay. And so since then, do you have any knowledge that this conference brought those two different races together in solidarity?
Yeah, no, I think it was absolutely like very successful in doing that in an African and Asian context.
Okay. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions, any of the participants. It looks like we have about 35 participants on the call. Does anybody have any questions for Raven?
Yep. You know that's dangerous if you open it up, Bev, right? Because I'm not gonna filibuster. I will just say one thing because I'm a history buff, and then we'll open it up if others have questions. But Raven, I appreciate you mentioning the history, how Black History Month started, and Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln's birthdays being so close together. By the way, Abraham Lincoln's is February 12th. Frederick Douglass's is the 14th, Valentine's Day, love, which I think is appropriate for an abolitionist. But Frederick Douglass, one of his famous speeches was about Asian American immigration, supporting immigration of Asian Americans. So as an abolitionist, he wanted all people to have the same rights, very similar to Martin Luther King Jr. So it's just one of those nuggets. It's like the deeper you dig, especially into really powerful American historical figures, they all had a common thread of love, tolerance, and they all, encouraged intersectionality so we could all see the good in one another. So I just thought that when you brought up, this conference here and in the history of Black Americans and how that intersects with Asian Americans. That was one of the facts that I was like, I've got to mention this to the team here, because Black History Month is really, founded on Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and there's a direct intersectionality between Frederick Douglass and Asian Americans. So, all right, that's it. I'll open it up to other folks. Yep.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess just one thing to add on to that, there's a very strong history of like solidarity between Black and Asian communities in the US. I mean, another famous example is Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech, where he's condemning like US imperialism and the hand that the very strong hand that the United States had in the creation of the Vietnam War, and like interjecting themselves into that transnational situation. So yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of prominent Black leaders have imagined like our freedom as intersectionally, as you said, like related to Asian American folks. Did we want to take more questions or?
I think we may be good at this point. Or even if you're able to continue, then we can take some more questions at the end. And then run through announcements.
Okay, sounds good. Is the screen still sharing? Can everyone still see it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. Let me just run the place.
And Raven, one quick note: would you be able to slow down just a little bit? We're going through some dense content, so we really want to make sure folks are able to digest some individual tidbits.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so why don't we move forward and talk a little bit about the mono-minority myth as well as the problem minority myth. So this idea that all Asian American people are a model minority is a stereotype. And it creates a cultural expectation that all Asian American people will be smart, naturally talented in STEM fields, so that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, wealthy, hardworking, self-reliant, docile, submissive, obedient, and uncomplaining. In other words, Asian American people become a prime example of people who immigrated to this country and achieved the American dream. On a surface level, this seems like a very flattering stereotype. In theory, it's a compliment to be considered smart, wealthy, and an example to be followed. But in practice, this myth is extremely damaging. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why and how it's related to the problem minority myth. So first of all, this myth presumes that Asian people are a monolithic group. The terminology of Asian refers to a large demographic of people with a whole host of different ethnic identities. Indian folks, Chinese people, Hmong people, Thai people, so on and so forth. And to presume that Asian American people with an array of different cultural, geographical, and linguistic backgrounds will all move in the exact same way is not only inaccurate, but also damaging. This assertion erases the specificity of ethnic identities and the various educational and financial opportunities that Asian American people have in this country. So I wanted to look at some statistics that sort of illustrate this, like why this myth is so harmful, how it creates a monolith of Asian American people, and how we can sort of disrupt that. So in 2022, the Economic Policy Institute released a study titled Understanding Economic Disparities Within the AAPI Community. In this study, they demonstrate the vast economic range that exists when we look at hourly wages for different Asian and Pacific Islander ethnic groups. So if you take a look at the graph on the screen, you'll see that Indian people, Chinese people, Malaysian people, so on and so forth, all make an hourly wage that exceeds the US average, so that red bar in the middle. Essentially, all the Asian and Pacific Islander ethnic groups that are above that red bar. But if you look below that red bar, you'll see that there are plenty of people who don't. And for Bhutanese folks who are at the very bottom of this graph, we see that their hourly wage is on average just half of the US average. So the US average is $29.95, whereas Bhutanese people are on average making $15.36 an hour. And as we know, economic standing is also intimately linked to educational opportunity. So the quality of our schools is directly reflected by the value of property in our neighborhoods and the amount of tax dollars that aren't flowing into public education institutions as a result. So hopefully you can see clearly the harm that the mono-minority myth causes. because it not only posits Asian American people as a monolith, but also actively obfuscates the very real marginalization that many Asian American and Pacific Islander people are experiencing today. I also want to note that just because on average, if we look back at this graph, just because on average Indian people and Malaysian people are, and all the ethnicities above this red bar, right? Just because on average these folks in these ethnic categories are making more than the national average of the hourly rate, that doesn't mean that there are no poor Indian people, no poor Malaysian people, etc. So these are just averages, and we need to be careful not to use these numbers to make totalizing statements about any specific ethnic group. And then one last thing I'll say before we talk about the problem minority myth is that this idea that all Asian American people have made it and they're successful also serves to undermine the very real anti-Asian hate that we've been talking about, and the discrimination that not only persists, but is also growing today. So how does all this tie into the problem minority myth? This is sort of a dichotomy or duality that I'm trying to highlight here. And what is the problem minority myth? Like, what is this? How does it both relate, and what is the problem minority myth? So what happens is that the idea of the model minority gets weaponized to create a problem minority myth. The assertion goes a little something like this, and I've written it down. If I was the problematic person that was asserting this myth, well, if Asian American people can ascend and be successful, then why can't other minority groups like Black folks do the same? It must be because they have some kind of personal failing, or they're inherently lazy. Because all Asian American people did it, they're achieving the American dream, so what's stopping anyone else? And of course, there's a whole lot that's wrong with this line of reasoning, but this is sort of what creates the conditions for the problem minority myth. Not only in this messed up scenario are Asian American people being positioned as a monolithic group, but all Black people are also being positioned as a monolithic group. Black folks as a whole are imagined as the problem, which is deeply ironic in so many ways. African American people wouldn't be in this country if our ancestors weren't stolen from the western shores of Africa, brought to North America, and many other locales, so not just Canada and the United States, but across the Caribbean, et cetera, and forced to labor and breed more enslavable property for the sole purpose of building intergenerational white wealth, which, by the way, condemned the Black community to intergenerational poverty in a country that we helped to make wealthy in the first place. But we're the problem, right? So it's, you can see how like insidious these myths are, and how they create all these fallacies about how we relate to one another. And perhaps the worst part of this is that the idea of the model minority pits students of color against each other. So it becomes an oppression Olympics of sorts, if you've heard that term before. So there's this idea that, well, if Asian American people pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, then why can't you? Insert other marginalized group. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most powerful mechanisms of white supremacy. And by that, I mean it creates narratives and fallacies that pit those on the margins against one another. And so we spend our time fighting each other and resenting one another instead of recognizing our shared enemy, which is white supremacist ideology and people who choose to uphold it. And if you walk away from this talk today with one thing, I would really urge you to ask yourself this: do you want to be a tool of white supremacy, or do you want to dismantle white supremacy? You cannot do both. And for folks on the call who don't identify as people of color, you absolutely have a role to play in this fight as well, and a really important one at that. You also get to decide if you want to be a tool of white supremacy or to dismantle it. White people and white supremacy, as I noted earlier, are not the same thing. Being white doesn't necessarily mean you have to uphold the tenets of white supremacy. White supremacy persists because many people who benefit from it continue to uphold these systems and ideologies. And even communities that are targeted by white supremacy often help to circulate these fallacies and stereotypes because they become so commonplace that people assume they must be the truth. So as a white person, actively and intentionally bringing people from the margins to the center and weaponizing your privilege as a white person to dismantle white supremacy are excellent places to start or continue doing the work. I think in the interest of time, we won't watch this video. Maybe I can send it to Mo and it can be circulated later, but this is just a really great video by that was a part of the show called Adam Ruins Everything, that really kind of illustrates more of the background of the model minority myth, how it came to be, and the harms that it causes. But like I said, in the interest of time, I think we'll just scooch past that and I'll help circulate it later. So of course, I want to note too, that we can't really ignore that there are absolutely anti-Black sentiments that circulate in Asian and Asian American communities, as well as anti-Asian sentiments that circulate in Black communities. right? So just because these fallacies and stereotypes are devices of white supremacy doesn't mean that we haven't also internalized these things into our respective communities. So when people ask me, you know, what do we do about this? I think there is a complicated answer and response. I think we have to be willing to continually do the work of unlearning harmful stereotypes that we've consciously and unconsciously been imbued with. This is the first step, radical self-transformation. So learning about the problem. We can't do anything if we don't know what the problem is. And attending this talk today is definitely an excellent first or continuing step on your journey. Secondly, you know, as we're doing the work of educating ourselves, we have to bring that information to our communities. So this means having important and uncomfortable conversations with the people in your life who maybe articulate harmful sentiments or have harmful ideologies that they're spewing, right? So I'll give a personal example because I like to think of my life as a lesson, and I often share personal anecdotes when I'm teaching. And during a break from school, so this was an undergrad, I flew home to Houston, Texas, and my grandpa picked me up from the airport. And this is my grandpa on my mom's side of the family, so he's an elderly Black man. And as we were driving on the side street to get on the freeway, someone cut him off, and his immediate reaction was to get upset and make this comment very rashly that they were probably Asian, which instantly obviously raised alarm bells in my head. So I asked him, why would you assume that? To which he responded that Asian people can't half drive. And this, of course, is a really harmful stereotype. And even though it was really uncomfortable, I proceeded to explain to him why that's not okay to say and how the sentiment is deeply harmful. So the point in telling this story is that we can't be so afraid of discomfort that we're unwilling to have hard conversations. These problems won't go away unless we actively and collectively do the work to make them go away. Yes, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about US imperialism in the Pacific. I think there's also absolutely a level of contention that exists between Black folks and people indigenous to the Pacific. The main reason is that many Black people arrived to the Pacific via the participation in the military. And you know, it's no secret that the United States is a massive imperial force. And one of the ways that they exercise this power is by placing military bases all over the world. And this includes islands in the Pacific Ocean. Oftentimes, the placement of these bases are seen as an intrusion and unwelcome presence by the indigenous residents of these islands. And in the case of Hawaii, for example, this is certainly the case. Many people don't know this, but Hawaii is part of the United States because it was colonized and annexed in 1898. And after this whole process of colonization, we see that there are many military bases that have been set up throughout the islands in Hawaii. And there are many Black folks who work for the United States government on these military bases. Blackness in the Pacific has, in a way, largely come to be associated with a militarized presence. And oftentimes there's the presumption that if someone Black is in the Pacific, they're most likely there working for the military. And as you know, I mean, that's real, right? And the tensions this participation can breed between folks who are indigenous to Oceania, so this, like the various islands in the Pacific, the tensions that this can breed between indigenous folks in this region of the world and Black people is very valid. And we can make very similar statements about the Vietnam War, as well as the Korean War, and the participation of many Black people in these US imperialist quests. Though it should be noted that both of these wars drafted men, conscripted American men, so we shouldn't necessarily make the assumption that everyone participated of their own volition. So we simultaneously have to hold space for the fact that yes, Black people have participated in imperialism in Asia and the Pacific, and the Black community has contributed to tremendous harm. That being said, because of the vulnerable economic position many Black Americans find themselves in, they are more likely to be targeted by programs like ROTC and the promise of security through the military, ironically serving a country that created the intergenerational poverty that necessitated they serve their country in the first place. And what I'm really trying to highlight here is that this vicious cycle of pain and harm adds fuel to the fire and creates this almost smoke screen that to an uncritical eye can make it seem as though Black people must be or naturally are the enemies of Asian people, Asian American people, and Pacific Islander peoples. But hopefully I've done a decent job convincing you that this is not the case. And we have so much more to gain by underlining our similarities than leaning into our perceived differences. Let's see, I think by way of closing, so I want to leave some time for us to have a conversation, I'll jump to sort of some of my closing remarks. So these slides, we spoke a little bit about the Bandung Conference, and then I was just going to share another example of solidarity. So highlighting that, yes, there is contention, but there's also tremendous coalition and solidarity between our communities. And this is sort of an example of Black Pacific Islander solidarity with the movement for Black Lives. This was the summer of 2020, where a lot of people, West Papuan Melanesian people, so those folks that we were talking about who in the Pacific, they're indigenous to the Pacific, but they're racialized as Black, they had experienced like police brutality at the hands of the Indonesian colonial government. And there were like all these really interesting signs that were manifesting as they were protesting, where they were drawing parallels between the harm that had been caused against like Papuan folks. So sorry, I'm looking at my notes, I'm like riffing now for this last bit. Wherein a Papuan man was targeted by the police force in Indonesia, and he was placed under like the foot of a police officer, and the imagery, the iconography is very similar to what happened to George Floyd in the United States. So we see this like kind of parallel being drawn between Papuan Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter. We also see the ways in which Melanesian people being racialized as Black also means that a lot of the harmful like racist language that Black people in the United States experience gets thrown against them. So this, they've like absolutely been called, you know, monkey. That's the critique that's being made here. Like, don't call us that. That's not what we are. We're people. We're human beings. And then I just wanted to leave you before we kind of close out with maybe a couple questions and final thoughts. You know, with this idea that you know, I don't want any of us walking away from the session today thinking that Asian people, Black people, or Pacific Islander folks are completely discrete or different communities. You know, in a country that's becoming increasingly multiracial, so now I'm talking about the United States, and in a country where interracial unions and marriages are on the rise, creating solidarity between communities is becoming increasingly urgent. Not that it wasn't urgent before, but for multiracial, multicultural, and/or multi-ethnic folks caught between communities, we intimately feel these tensions and discontents that we've been talking about and unpacking. There are Black and Asian people, there are Indigenous and Black people, there are Indigenous and Asian people, right? And we have to stop imagining ourselves as these discrete, knowable entities, because that's just not the case. That's not the way the world has been, and it's certainly not the way that it's evolving. And so in terms of like future directions to take some of this information in and do something actionable with it in your own personal life, I think one thing that's really, really important is improving media representation, right? So this idea that while representation is not the entire answer, it certainly matters. People need to see themselves portrayed. So some of these Black and Asian American freedom struggles showing up on the screen, being talked about, being celebrated, being uplifted, moved from the margins to the center, really, really important. Another thing is, you know, redefining, disrupting these harmful stereotypes and concepts of masculinities and femininities that we've been discussing as it pertains to Black and Asian communities. So now that you're aware of these stereotypes, how can you actively disrupt them, challenge them when you encounter them out in the world? Also building solidarity with other marginalized populations, right? And like being really, really intentional about that, because we have to recognize that freedom is a collective process. We have to do this with other folks. And so we need to be deeply in community with other people in a meaningful way beyond the surface or the surface level. You know, creating space in both corporate and personal settings for Black, Asian, and Indigenous Oceanic people to be in community with one another. So how can we continue to have events like this, bring folks together from different communities and foster the solidarity? Also, you know, continuing to have teaching opportunities like this, bringing scholars in who can share their expertise, can share their insights, so that we can all broaden our worldview. Personal and communal education, so that's what we were talking about in terms of you know, that radical self-transformation, and then bringing that to community to inform and enrich the people that you share space and time with. And then, you know, lastly, but certainly not least, like when you see hate, to feel empowered and to feel responsibility. So not just to feel empowered, to feel a responsibility to speak on it. Because if we allow those sentiments to be commonplace and to be upheld, then they're not going to go away. We have to be willing to challenge them even when it's deeply, deeply uncomfortable. And so, yeah, I just want to thank you so much for your time, for having me today. Again, my name is Raven Schwam-Curtis. I make content full time on TikTok and Instagram at Raven Reveal, so you can find me everywhere with that handle. And this is my contact information if you had questions or comments or concerns or anything you wanted to discuss more from this presentation today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raven, you know, for a really thoughtful and enlightening discussion. Really hit on a lot of topics, a lot of really tough conversations that we typically don't have in our circles, specifically on gender and femininity, and, you know, how that intersects with, you know, so much of our daily lives. And I think I'll start with one question. I know we have a few minutes left before we have to hop off, and I know we want to get to announcements as well. But I think, how do we make our solidarity together, and how do we make some of these historical truths more meaningful in like this current day and age? And I think, specifically against oppressive systems, how do we, sort of battle against a system that's kind of looking to discount these histories, right? How do we bring that to the limelight? How do we work with, community-based organizations or municipalities or people who are responsible for, bringing our essence to the foreground? What are some ways that we can elevate our voices in this way?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one really important thing is making sure that our organizing efforts, like political or otherwise, aren't siloed, that we're deeply in community with one another, working with one another, imagining like policies and actionable things that we can do together, not like in a vacuum, but together, right? So I think that's one really important step to take. And then also, going beyond the learning through like social media and like actually like being friends, being in community with people from different backgrounds. I think there needs to be a deeper dive that needs to happen for that to take place. And I guess another example, this is outside the purview of Afro-Asian solidarity, but even like when I'm in Jewish organizing spaces and they talk about what is needed, talking about how sometimes there will be organizing events that are planned on a Friday, but many Jewish folks who are observant can't attend that because they're celebrating Shabbat. And so what are the ways that we can be more culturally and religiously sensitive to each other so that we can come together in a meaningful way? I think is really important.
And I'll open it up to folks who have joined us. Are there any questions for Raven? Maybe we can get one in before we move to announcements. Feel free to raise your hand or add it to the chat. Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia. Oh, Cynthia, you're breaking up a little bit. We can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I would just want to say that I didn't even realize that I had been entertaining those stereotypical thoughts, and I never ever had to address that, what I thought about Asian people. I mean, I really don't encounter them all the time. But when I do, you do have those frameworks, and it's so funny how, having been subjected to those types of thoughts and stereotypes, how easily you do the same thing for other people that you're not familiar with. This is really enlightening. I would love to have some of that literature that you're reading from, just for my own growth. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I'm happy to circulate. I'm sure y'all can tell I'm a big nerd, so I read a lot. I'm happy to circulate some like additional resources or books or documentaries that you can watch to engage more with this topic. But I mean, that's real, and that's what we're really discussing today. That's one of the most insidious ways that white supremacy operates. That these fallacies, these stereotypes, like do become unconscious bias because they're circulated so much in our interpersonal interactions through the media that they become like a truth, right? They parade as a truth anyways. And so we internalize that and then we enact it as we engage with other people out in the world without even necessarily realizing that we've been imbued with these stereotypes. And so I think illuminating them and then actively disrupting them and challenging them is really important.
Wendy, I see your hand up.
Yes, and I just want to say thank you for doing this. I unfortunately missed the beginning of it due to a work conflict, but I love what you were talking about, and it reminds me a lot of a passage that I think about a lot from John Okada's No No Boy, where he talks about basically where all the races are so busy kind of pointing fingers at each other that we are contributing to the system that you're talking about, that we're not united in trying to dismantle the system of oppression, but that we're really contributing to it. And so I just think it's, I love that you shared that, because I don't think, when I took that class and had to read that book, it was many moons ago. And it was in a literature class. And, I just don't think it is part of the mainstream educational process. And so people don't realize it until it's, like you said, we are willing to have those uncomfortable conversations and discuss it. So I just want to say thank you for bringing it here. It was really great, and I wish I had seen the beginning of it, but I know this is being recorded, so I'll go back and watch it. So thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. I so appreciate that. And it just couldn't be more true. This idea of an oppression Olympics is real. This idea that white supremacy posits us as against one another, like imagining one another as the problem. And well, my piece of the pie is this big, and so why is your piece of the pie that big, as opposed to questioning who has the entire other half of the pie, right? Like that's the thing we should be thinking critically about, and focusing our energies towards, but it's very easy to get distracted.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Raven, for a thoughtful and enlightening discussion on Afro-Asian solidarity and broader topics of racial inequality, disparity, and just marginalization, right? Also, big shout out to Mackenzie Houston for co-leading this event on behalf of Be Bold, as well as Shima for representing Mosaic, the Mosaic ERG, as a co-lead for this event. So thank you for those two folks. For folks on the call, before we close out this event, Mackenzie, are you able to share your screen to go to the announcement slide?
Yes, let me bring that up.
Okay, so similar to our last event, I do want to share a couple of polls for folks who are interested in either joining in a leadership role within Be Bold, or if you're interested in joining a subcommittee. We have a planning and programming subcommittee, we have a marketing and media subcommittee, a membership subcommittee, and then recruiting and a technical practice subcommittee. So please check those out and submit your responses. Otherwise, if you can direct your attention to the screen, we also have two major events coming up next week. I encourage you all to join our executive panel. That'll be next Tuesday, February 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 12 p.m. Central Standard Time, and 10 at Pacific Standard Time. Also, we have our Moonlight Trivia event. So similar to our Hidden Figures Trivia event, we'll have an event next Wednesday in collaboration with our Pride ERG. And there will be prizes for that event. So be on the lookout for an event poster for that. And then lastly, we have our Afro-Latino DJ hour to close up Black History Month. So we're really looking forward to that. But for folks who are able to join, thank you so much for joining. I hope it was informative. Hope it was. I hope you learned something. These are very tough conversations, and they're not conversations that typically come across our corporate sphere, but are definitely worthwhile having and worthwhile sharing and thinking critically about. So thank you all for joining. Thank you all to the Mosaic ERG in support of this event, and obviously thank you, Raven, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. And then with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks, folks, for joining.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.